Picture this. London, the year 1455. The stones of Westminster Palace are damp with the weight of early spring rain. Inside the chambers of the Lancaster court, whispers travel faster than footsteps. They all speak of a child, Margaret Beaufort, only 12 years old, an heiress whose bloodline carries both fortune and curse. Margaret walks through the long corridor, her slippers barely making a sound on the polished floor. Her body is small, almost swallowed by the heavy velvet gown stitched with the Beaufort crest. Pearls gleam in her auburn hair, but her face is pale with silence. Every glance at her reminds the courtiers of a dynasty on the brink. She is promised not to God, not to safety, but to a man twice her age. Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI, waits for her across the threshold. The child pauses, fingers clutching the edge of her gown. She knows nothing of marriage. She knows only that her name, her body, her future are tools placed on the table of war. In Westminster's Great Hall, King Henry VI himself presides. Thin, nervous, lost in visions only he can see, the king speaks softly of God's will and England's survival. His crown tilts as he gestures toward the girl. Margaret Beaufort, the last great hope of her family's claim. Imagine her gaze in that moment, eyes wide but fixed on the floor. She does not look at Edmund Tudor, the tall, stern man in fur-trimmed cloak. She does not look at Henry VI. She only listens to the words spoken over her life, words she cannot refuse. Because in this court, silence is obedience, and obedience is survival. Pause here and think of it. A 12-year-old child, wrapped in silks too heavy for her shoulders, forced to bear the weight of a dynasty older than she can even name. If you want to uncover how child brides were sacrificed for dynasties, stay with me until the end of this story. Because Margaret Beaufort's silence would echo louder than any scream. The year is 1455. England is cracking open into civil war, Lancaster against York. Men sharpened swords in shadowed halls, but the true battles are fought with marriages, births and heirs. Margaret Beaufort becomes such a weapon. She is no longer a child in the eyes of her family. She is a vessel, a bridge between bloodlines, her womb valued more than her voice. At Westminster, the marriage is sealed not with joy, but calculation. Priests intone sacred vows, the words bouncing off the stone arches. Margaret repeats them, her voice thin as thread, each syllable trembling as though spoken by someone else. The courtiers nod, satisfied. They do not see the child, they see the prize. They see the Beaufort blood, legitimized through centuries of ambition. And when Edmund Tudor looks at his bride, his expression is not tender. It is cold, resolute. He sees not her fragility, but her value, the key to the throne's survival. London's churches echo with bells. Outside, the people celebrate what they think is union. Inside, Margaret kneels, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whiten. She prays, but not for happiness. She prays for protection. Protection from a marriage bed she cannot yet imagine. Protection from a future she cannot yet refuse. Her name is repeated endlessly that day. Margaret Beaufort, daughter of John Beaufort, heir of a bloodline cursed by legitimacy, debated and survival questioned. Whispers say her lineage is weak. Others say it is dangerous. But all agree. Her body may determine the crown of England. Think of the contrast. The child's small figure bent beneath cathedral arches, and the great weight of expectation pressing upon her. The vows feel less like holy promise, more like iron shackles. By dusk, the union is done. Margaret, still only 12, is carried away to Edmund Tudor's keeping. The court returns to its schemes, its whispers, its wars. King Henry VI drifts back into visions, his weak smile fading into confusion. And Margaret. She walks from Westminster into the silence of her chambers, her pearl crown slipping slightly from her braided hair. A girl who once played in gardens, now locked in the role of wife. Her story is only beginning, and already it feels like the ending of childhood. The journey from Westminster to Wales felt like exile. Winter winds cut through the countryside, lashing against the carriage that carried Lady Margaret Beaufort, barely 12, to her new husband's domain. South Wales stretched out cold and unwelcoming, its hills dark with mist, its castles heavy with silence. When she arrived at Edmund Tudor's stronghold, the walls seemed to lean inward, stone pressing against her lungs. The air smelled of damp rushes and iron. Servants bowed in silence, eyes lowered, as though even they knew what was coming. Margaret was dressed in ivory silk, a gown that dragged behind her as she walked across the cold floor. Her auburn hair, braided with pearls, shimmered in the torchlight, but her face, pale, drawn, uncertain, betrayed that she was still only a child. Edmund Tudor, 24, stood waiting. Tall, broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable. His fur-lined cloak framed him as though he were already a king. When his gaze settled on Margaret, it was not with affection, it was with ownership. The attendants prepared the chamber. Alice Chaucer, Margaret's guardian, tried to soften the room. She placed lavender near the bed, smoothed the sheets, whispered small comforts that went unheard. She was a loyal servant, but powerless to stop what had been commanded. The bed itself loomed like an altar, heavy oak carved with Tudor roses, curtains of deep crimson. Its presence filled the chamber like judgment. When the doors closed, Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. She clasped her hands tightly, whispering prayers into the folds of her gown. God, make me unseen. God, make me untouched. But the silence around her gave no answer. Edmund moved slowly, deliberately. His steps echoed against the stone, heavy-eared verdicts. He didn't speak of love or of comfort. He spoke of duty. This union, he said, will strengthen the crown. You carry the hope of England in your womb. Margaret's breath caught. At 12, she did not even fully understand the words, but she understood the fear. The chamber was suffocating. The fire in the hearth snapped and hissed, but its warmth never reached her. The shadows pressed closer, swallowing the edges of the room. Alice Chaucer stood beyond the curtain, listening, praying herself, though she dared not intervene. The servants outside whispered, some in pity, some in approval, all in silence that shielded cruelty. The marriage bed became battlefield, not with swords or bloodshed, but with power. Edmund asserted his right as husband. Margaret endured in silence. Her body, frail and unprepared, became the ground upon which dynasties would rise or fall. She whispered prayers through clenched teeth, each word drowned beneath the creak of bedposts, beneath the rhythm of a duty forced upon her. The contrast was unbearable. Pearls slipped from her braid onto the sheets, gleaming like fallen tears. The silk gown that once symbolized innocence now twisted like chains around her body. Outside, the wind battered the shutters. The storm seemed to echo her heart, frantic, desperate, unanswered. By morning, the chamber smelled of extinguished fire, sweat and silence. Margaret lay still, staring at the carved beams above her head. Her lips moved in prayer, though no sound escaped. Edmund rose without a word, adjusting his cloak. He left as though nothing had happened, as though duty had simply been completed. His boots echoed down the corridor, fading into the distance. Alice Chaucer entered quietly, her eyes brimming with pity. She tucked the sheets around Margaret, brushed a pearl from the pillow and whispered, "Rest, my lady." But Margaret could not rest. She knew now the truth of her marriage. She was not a wife in the tender sense. She was not a child any longer. She was property. And in the silence of that Welsh castle, in the deep winter of 1455, Lady Margaret Beaufort's childhood ended, not with ceremony, but with shadows. The winter of 1456 was harsh in Wales. Snow pressed against the castle walls, sealing the world outside in silence. Inside those cold stone chambers, Lady Margaret Beaufort, only 13 years old, carried a weight her body was never meant to bear. Her belly swelled, round and heavy, beneath gowns cut far too large for a child's frame. Her steps grew slower. Her back ached with every movement. At night she curled against the pillows, whispering prayers into the darkness. Prayers for strength, prayers for deliverance. But the whispers of the servants told a different story. They did not see a girl in pain. They saw a vessel. They saw the womb of the Beaufort line, carrying Edmund Tudor's heir. Some whispered in pity, too young, too fragile. Others whispered in calculation, if she survives, the boy may carry the crown. Margaret's guardian, Alice Chaucer, tried to shield her. She brought warm broth, pressed cool cloths to her brow, tucked furs around her shoulders when the draughts cut through the chamber. But Alice could not shield her from the fear. Every pain was magnified, every spasm a reminder that her body was a battlefield. At times, Margaret would clutch her stomach, her lips white as bone, gasping between words. "Is it supposed to hurt like this?" she whispered once to Alice. And Alice, unable to lie, only held her hand in silence. It was then that Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, became a presence in her world. Jasper, handsome and steady, visited the castle often. He spoke of duty, of how the child within her carried the hope of Lancaster. He assured her that God had chosen her for this suffering. Margaret listened, but she did not answer. How could she? At 13, her body bent under pain that no blessing could soften. The contrast was cruel. Outside her chamber, banners of the Red Rose of Lancaster fluttered proudly in the wind, symbols of power. Inside, a child cried into her sheets, trembling at the thought of giving birth before she'd even learned what womanhood truly meant. Her days blurred into one another, the smell of damp stone, the clatter of wooden trays, the muted steps of servants afraid to speak too loudly. Every sound seemed to echo her isolation. When she walked through the corridors, courtiers bowed, yet their eyes fixed not on her face but on the curve of her belly. She felt their gaze like chains. It was not Margaret they cared about. It was the child, the boy they hoped for, the heir they expected. Her body was not her own. It was a weapon, a cage, a prison draped in silk. At night, the castle seemed to close in tighter. The shutters rattled against the wind, the fire sank low, and Margaret lay awake, her hands pressed to her stomach. Sometimes she thought she felt the faintest movement beneath her skin, and fear jolted through her like lightning. Would this child kill her? Would it save her? Would it matter? No one asked what she wanted. No one asked if she was ready, because readiness was irrelevant. The decision had already been made. By early spring of 1456, Margaret's body was failing. She grew thin everywhere but her stomach. Her face hollowed, her lips cracked with fever. Yet the courtiers smiled when they saw her. A strong sign, they said. The child thrives. Margaret wanted to scream, but she did not. She bowed her head, she folded her hands, and she whispered another prayer. Because at 13 she had learned this truth. Her voice was worthless, her body was priceless, and her swollen belly was both her doom and her only chance to survive. The corridors of Carmarthen Castle smelled of sickness. a bitter mixture of damp stones, smoke, and the sour breath of plague. Servants whispered as they carried bowls of vinegar water, as if even the sound of their voices might invite death closer. And then it came. Edmund Tudor, husband to Lady Margaret Beaufort, was struck down at only 26. His body, strong enough for battle, could not withstand the fever that devoured him in days. For Margaret, the news fell like a hammer. She was 13, heavy with child, and suddenly a widow. They told her quietly, in the dim light of her chamber. Her guardian, Alice Chaucer, wept openly, but Margaret did not. She sat frozen, her small hands pressed to the swell of her stomach. Widowed at 13, pregnant at 13. The words echoed in her mind louder than any church bell. The walls of Carmarthen seemed to close around her. What protection did she have now? Edmund's name was gone, his authority gone, and with it, the shield she barely understood had been covering her. The castle whispered already. Some said Edmund's death was God's judgment. Others claimed it was Lancaster's curse. A few even suggested it was better this way. The union had been too fragile, too forced, doomed from the start. But for Margaret there was no relief, only dread. The air itself seemed colder, pressing against her chest. She remembered Edmund's stern face, his heavy cloak, the voice that spoke of duty instead of love. She remembered the way he looked at her, not as wife, but as possession. And yet, in death, even that control was gone, and in its place, only uncertainty. It was then that Jasper Tudor stepped forward, younger than Edmund but steadier. His presence filled the halls where fear lingered. He came to Margaret's chamber, bowing his head before her. "Your safety is my duty now," he told her. His voice was calm, his dark auburn hair catching the light of the hearth. Margaret looked at him, unsure whether to believe. She was only a girl, and yet she carried the future of his family in her womb. Would Jasper protect her, or would he protect only the unborn child? The silence between them said everything. The plague lingered outside the castle walls, devouring villages. Inside, Margaret's own body waged its own war. Each day of pregnancy grew heavier, each night stretched longer, and now, without Edmund, the whispers sharpened. If she dies in childbirth, some said, the Beaufort claim dies with her. If the child survives, others countered, Lancaster will have hope again. Hope, fear, survival. They were words thrown around like dice, as if Margaret were not a human life, but a gamble. She walked once through the courtyard, the cold air biting against her cheeks. Servants bowed, but their eyes lingered on her stomach. Her belly had become her prison, and her shield all at once. Jasper walked beside her, silent, protective, but even his presence could not quiet the storm in her mind. She remembered Edmund's absence with each step. His boots would no longer echo in the halls, his shadow no longer stretched across the chamber floor. And though she'd never loved him, his death left her exposed, vulnerable, afraid. At night she dreamt of sickness. She dreamt of fevered faces and stone corridors echoing with coughs. She woke gasping, clutching her stomach, whispering, "Not yet. Please, not yet." Alice Chaucer would come, brushing back her hair, murmuring prayers. But prayers felt weak against the enormity of her fear. What if the child died? What if she died first? What if everything ended here, in Carmarthen's cold silence? Yet beneath the terror, something hardened. In the absence of Edmund's control, Margaret felt the faint stirrings of her own will. She was only 13, yet she began to see her child as more than burden. This child was survival. This child was power. Widowhood had stripped her bare, but it had also forced her into clarity. Margaret Beaufort, the girl no one thought strong enough to endure, now faced her most dangerous trial alone. And the fate of Lancaster would rest on whether a 13-year-old widow could endure the agony still to come. The winter of 1457 gripped Pembroke Castle in silence. Snow piled against the battlements, wind howled through narrow windows, and every torch seemed to burn lower than it should. Inside, in a chamber heavy with rushes and smoke, Lady Margaret Beaufort lay on a birthing bed. She was only 13. Her body was slight, too fragile for the weight it carried. Sweat dampened her hair, pearls slipping loose from her braid. The midwives whispered to one another, glancing nervously toward Alice Chaucer, Margaret's guardian, who stood pale with fear at the foot of the bed. Margaret's lips moved constantly, words of prayer, fragments of scripture, her voice breaking into cries she tried to swallow. The ordeal had begun hours before, and already her strength was failing. The chamber was suffocating. The fire snapped in the hearth, but its heat only thickened the air. Servants wrung cloths in basins of water, the scent of iron and sweat clinging to everything. When the pains came, Margaret's small hands clawed at the sheets. She gasped, eyes wide, whispering, "God, let me live." Her cries echoed off the stone, and for a moment it seemed the whole castle held its breath. Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law, now her protector, waited outside the door. He paced the corridor, the sound of his boots steady, as though rhythm alone could steady his heart. He could not go in, he could not help. But he knew that the future of Lancaster lay on the other side of those wooden doors. The hours dragged on. The midwives urged, pressed, commanded. Alice held Margaret's hand, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Breathe, my lady. Hold on." But Margaret's body was too small, too weak. Each contraction was a knife cutting through her. Each cry grew sharper, then weaker. The women in the room exchanged looks of dread. Some believed she would not survive. At one point, Margaret's head fell back against the pillow. Her eyes rolled closed, her lips pale. Alice bent low, shaking her gently, whispering her name again and again. "Margaret, Margaret, do not leave us." And then, the cry, not hers, but his. An infant's cry split the chamber. Thin, piercing, alive. The sound tore through the fear like a blade through silk. The midwife lifted the child high into the torchlight. Small, red-skinned, fragile, but breathing. Alice gasped, tears spilling freely. Jasper outside the door froze as the sound reached him. His pacing stopped. His shoulders dropped with relief. Inside, Margaret stirred, opening her eyes slowly. Her body was broken with exhaustion, her breath shallow. But when they placed the child in her arms, something shifted. She looked down at the tiny face swaddled in linen, his fists clenched, his mouth open in hungry protest. Henry Tudor, her son. In that moment, the chamber blurred away. The pain, the whispers, the fear of death, all of it was eclipsed by this fragile life pressed against her chest. Her voice, weak but steady, whispered, "For you, I endured." Alice bent beside her, tears sliding down her cheeks, whispering blessings over mother and child. Jasper entered then, careful, reverent, his step soft on the rushes. He bowed low before the bed, his eyes fixed on the boy. For the first time, Margaret saw not pity but awe in his face. Margaret cradled Henry closer, her body trembling. She knew she had nearly died. She knew the court would see him as a pawn, a symbol, a prize. But for her, he was more. This child was her answer to every prayer, her proof that survival had meaning, her flesh and blood, her sacrifice made living. Outside, snow fell silently against the castle walls, but within, in the heart of Pembroke, a new chapter began. Henry Tudor had entered the world, and though Margaret's body was frail, her determination was born anew. Because she now had something greater than fear to hold on to. She had a son, and through him, she would carve a dynasty. Margaret Beaufort was only 14, a widow, a mother, and already the air around her smelled of danger. Her son Henry, still an infant, was swaddled in linen and guarded as if the walls of Pembroke Castle themselves were not enough. But Margaret knew the truth. Castles could fall, loyalties could bend, and a child's life could be stolen in a whisper. The Wars of the Roses were unfolding like a storm. Lancaster and York, red rose against white. Men bled on fields from St Albans to Wakefield, yet in truth, the greater battles were fought in halls, not on battlefields. And Margaret, still a girl, was thrust into that war, not with sword in hand, but with her child in her arms. Every glance at Henry Tudor reminded the world of Lancaster's claim. Every whisper in the corridors measured whether he was threat, pawn or prize. Jasper Tudor stood at her side. Edmund's younger brother had taken her under his protection, his presence steady but stern. "Trust no one too easily," he told her once as they walked the draughty corridors. "Even smiles hide knives." Margaret listened. She had learned to listen. Her silence had become her armour, but silence could not shield her from the other women who moved these courts with venom in their veins. Cecily Neville, mother of Edward of York, was one. Tall, sharp-featured, clothed in silks that shimmered with wealth and certainty. She carried herself as if the crown already belonged to her children. When she looked at Margaret, it was not as one mother to another, but as predator to prey. Her eyes lingered not on Margaret herself, but on Henry, the boy who, even in swaddling clothes, represented a rival claim. And then there was Margaret of Anjou, queen consort to Henry VI, fierce, outspoken, her French silks trailing behind her like banners. She too saw Henry not as child, but as tool. She spoke of loyalty, of Lancaster's destiny, but her gaze cut sharp when it fell on Margaret. Between these two women, Cecily Neville and Margaret of Anjou, the young widow found herself trapped. Each sought to wield power through sons, through husbands, through whispered alliances, and Margaret's infant boy was now one of the most dangerous pieces on that board. The courtly halls were thick with murmurs. Servants carried trays of wine and bread, but their ears carried more than food. Counsellors bowed low, but their words bent like reeds to whichever wind seemed strongest that day. And Margaret walked among them, her head high, her silence heavier than speech. Yet inside, she felt the walls pressing closer. One misplaced word, one wrong ally, one misstep, and Henry could vanish into someone else's keeping. She clutched him often, pressing his small body to her chest as though she could shield him with her own frail frame. At night when he cried, she prayed over him, whispering promises. "You will live, you must live. For all that has been taken from me, you must live." The corridors grew colder, the laughter more brittle, the politics sharper. Margaret began to see faces differently. A bowed head might mean loyalty, or it might mean betrayal. She was no longer only a mother, she was a strategist in training. Her eyes learned to read gestures. Her ears learned to separate truth from lies. And her silence became a weapon, unnerving those who tried to guess what she thought. At 14, Margaret Beaufort realised that her survival, and her son's survival, would never be secured by love or pity. It would depend on vigilance, on patience, on learning how to move through a world where even the warmest smile could conceal a wolf's teeth. The years between 1457 and 1461 passed not in peace, but in tension. The Wars of the Roses deepened, Lancaster clashing with York, brothers turning against brothers, blood staining every oath. And in the middle of this storm stood a child, Henry Tudor, barely learning to stand, yet already marked as a prize worth killing for. Margaret Beaufort was only 14, then 15, still a widow, still fragile in frame. But within her something had hardened beyond her years. She moved through castles and court chambers draped in velvet gowns, her auburn hair crowned with pearls. But the silence she carried spoke louder than jewels. She had learned that to survive, to keep her sons safe, she must let others underestimate her. Behind her quiet eyes, every thought was sharpened like a blade. Jasper Tudor remained her shield. His presence was constant, in corridors, at councils, in the shadows where danger whispered. Yet even Jasper could not silence the threats. Yorkist envoys spread rumours, Cecily Neville pressed her son's claims, and every shift of battle placed Margaret and her child in peril. She listened as men spoke of heirs and bloodlines as though they were gambling pieces tossed across a board. None of them saw the terror in her sleepless nights, or the prayers whispered into her child's cradle. To them, Henry was potential. To her, he was survival. Margaret grew skilled in watching without speaking. She marked the hesitation in a servant's bow. She weighed the tones of counsellors who spoke too smoothly. She knew when to remain still, and when to let silence become accusation. Her life became a constant act of calculation, every word guarded, every step measured, every gaze controlled. And yet, beneath the control, the fear remained, because Margaret knew the truth. A woman's power was fragile, a child's claim was fragile, and both could be crushed in an instant. At night, the halls of whichever castle she inhabited echoed with dread. Sometimes Yorkist riders circled close, sometimes messages arrived with tidings of another Lancaster defeat. Sometimes it was only the silence, long, heavy, suffocating, that reminded her how close she lived to ruin. She would stand by the cradle, draped in her heavy gown, the velvet brushing against the rushes on the floor. She watched Henry's small chest rise and fall, his face soft in sleep, and she would whisper, "You will endure. You must." The words became mantra, a promise, a command. Every rival mother, Cecily Neville, Margaret of Anjou, fought for their sons' futures with ferocity. Margaret Beaufort was no different. But her battlefield was not the council chamber, not the sword-strewn fields. Her battlefield was survival itself, keeping Henry alive, keeping his claim alive, keeping herself invisible enough until the moment would come. By 1461, the tide shifted again. Edward of York seized the throne, and the crown of England changed hands. The red, Rose of Lancaster dimmed, but it did not vanish. And Margaret, still barely 15, still cloaked in velvet too heavy for her shoulders, carried her son into this uncertain world. She knew the path ahead would not be simple. The throne would not be won by innocence or prayer or chance. It would be won by silence, by calculation, by sacrifice upon sacrifice. Imagine her there, a teenage widow standing alone in the half-lit chamber, the storm outside rattling the shutters, Jasper Tudor pacing beyond the door, Margaret herself, unmoving, eyes fixed on the cradle before her. Her son asleep, his tiny hand curled around nothing, dreaming the dreams of infants. And she knows. She knows the crown above his head will one day be stained with blood. She knows her silence will cost her everything. She knows her sacrifice will echo through generations. But she does not turn away. She stares at him. And in that silence, the fight for a throne has already begun.